Begin now. Today, we're going to talk about some other aspects of research with children. And the place I'm going to start is just by letting you understand the term action research. So, last time we discussed quantitative research strategies, such as descriptive studies, and inferential designs, such as experimental and correlational studies. Action research is a little different because action research is conducted in a hands-on kind of way. It's ongoing. It's conducted for the purpose of studying what you're doing in uh, direct contact with children, or so teachers, administrators, people who are working with children, and they want to know, is my strategy working? So the purpose of this isn't basic, it's just an applied kind of purpose to evaluate as I go what I'm doing, with the idea that I can improve uh, the the services or the educational strategies that I'm using. And action research works in a spiral. It works in a loop. So the researcher, because they're doing this as they go, they identify what they want to focus on. Perhaps it's, does my spelling lesson improve children's spelling? So they'll collect some data, they'll analyze it, interpret it, develop the plan to go forward, and then repeat. So it's this spiraling, ongoing idea of refining what you're doing based upon the information that you gather as you go. So it qualifies as research, but it's very different than the kind of research methods we talked about last time. Another entire category of research, if we had all those different quantitative methods, are qualitative studies. And qualitative studies, just like quantitative, can be either basic or applied. Uh, but qualitative studies, the goal isn't to assign a number to an individual's responses, or to measure a variable with numbers that we can compare. Instead, it's to describe what one observes, or conduct open-ended interviews to gather rich, thick descriptions of children's development. The goal is, instead of, if the goal of quantitative studies is to really focus on narrowing down and controlling for alternative explanations and controlling for other variables, qualitative studies seek to describe all of that in rich detail to really get a more full description of children's lives. So these are written narratives, or uh, maybe typed up as even a book or a child study. You want, the value of a qualitative study is that you can describe the context. How does this behavior fit in the surrounding uh, ecosystem? How do the things going on around this child interact and impact their behavior or development? And the goal is to look over time for trends or patterns that can be identified. One type of qualitative research is called an ethnographic study. And ethnographic studies really borrow the method from the field of anthropology. So the goal of an ethnographic study is to look within a particular group and write a narrative that's a rich description of how individuals interact with their culture. And so this is a particular way of getting the most complete pictures of development within a culture. So some differences between quantitative and qualitative methods. Quantitative methods count behaviors, they rate them, they use numbers to give a value. This is more, this is less. And this is really helpful because you can look across a large number of individuals and summarize things and capture trends. Or you can say, this school has better reading scores than that school. You can make those kinds of things with numbers that we can compare and understand and communicate. What quantitative methods miss that qualitative methods capture is that rich detail, uh, that fuller description that takes into account the culture, the social context around that individual. So quantitative methods can sometimes miss out on some of the really important things. On the flip side, qualitative methods are hard for us to get our heads around the results. If you have a whole rich description that takes a book to read, it's hard to summarize that in a way that we can communicate to each other easily. So if I have a real full description of this school, that can tell me a lot about that school, but it makes it hard to make comparisons with other schools. One, for both qualitative and quantitative studies, one of the most important things is dissemination and replication. So researchers will publish their findings in professional research journals, and there are journals that are geared towards very particular subject matter. And you can see here some pictures of some different journals that focus on children. That one right there is Young Children. It's the National Association for the Education of Young Children. This is Early Child Development and Care. This is a journal called Child Development from the Society of Research in Child Development. You may see some of these journals as you are doing, as you are writing papers in your future classes. The important thing about these journals is that they're peer reviewed. Okay. Peer reviewed means that the researcher wants to write their uh, description of their research in a way that other people can replicate it. So they're going to include an abstract, an introduction that says, why am I doing this? A method that has enough detail that somebody else could do exactly the same thing, what results they found, and their discussion of what they make of the results. What do the results mean? And when they send that article to the journal, an editor of the journal assigns people with expertise in that subject area to review that article. And they do this blind. They don't know who the author of the study is, and they don't reveal to the author their identity. So there's no uh, chance of people uh, showing some kind of bias there. The reviewers review that information for, does this sound like a well done study? And they can make comments back to the author that are passed along by the editor. And the reviewers give the editor information about the quality of that study, and it's used to decide if that study will be published or not. And that's called a peer review. And that's a different process than, say, a magazine or a website where the editor just decides, I like this, I'll publish it. So that peer review adds a level of rigor. And so I know you've heard of that statement because a lot of times you will have requirements in your classes to only use peer-reviewed sources, and it's because it gives that level of sort of scientific review. Now let's talk a little bit about the ethics involved in research, especially since we're talking about research with children. Children are a vulnerable class; they're minors, and our society views that they should have some extra protections. There's some other vulnerable classes too when it comes to research. Uh, Prisoners, for example, who might feel that participation in a research might give them time off or for good behavior, or they could be coerced into it. Another vulnerable population might be people with a terminal illness. Well, if you have terminal cancer, you might be willing to take uh, an experimental vaccine. So that puts you in a risky situation. Another vulnerable population might be pregnant women because they're physically uh, vulnerable to exposure to toxic things from the environment. So, considering that minors are one of these special classes of participants in research, it's important that we focus our research in ways that is not harmful and that the benefits of the research uh, outweigh the risk that we put the children in. You've all heard examples of things like the Milgram study. I think a better example for today might be what was later called the Monster study that was conducted in 1939 in Iowa. Uh, some researchers wanted to study children's stuttering, and they assigned 22 children who were orphans, so they were a particularly vulnerable group of children. They assigned them to either a treatment group or a control group, that classic kind of experimental design. The treatment group got positive reinforcement, positive feedback for when they did well with their speech. The, the other group, I don't want to call them a control group, so let's call it the other experimental group, they received negative feedback. So if they made any error, they were given derogatory information. They were uh, I don't want to say punished, but they were spoken to harshly. So they got negative, harsh feedback. And some of those children that got that went on. Some of them who didn't have speech problems to begin with went on to have some lifelong speech problems. So clearly, those researchers were causing harm for the children. They weren't protecting those children. So we've got to make sure it's safe. And one of the ways that we uh, ensure safety is through what's called informed consent. Informed consent means that the participants in a research study are given information about what the potential risk is so that they can decide to participate or not. And in the case of children, since they're minors, their parents have to agree to that informed consent. Another thing that's important is to protect their confidentiality and their privacy, because sometimes research might involve uh, information that is private, that people don't want out in the general public. So there has to be a way to maintain privacy. We don't write in the journal article the person's name, for example. Uh, Sometimes there does need to be some deception. I told you about a study where observers watched children in parents interact in a museum, and they didn't say, "Hey, we're here to interact with you, or to watch you to see how you interact with your children." They tried to appear like they were really studying about the displays themselves. Well, that kind of deception has to be approved beforehand by what's called an IRB, or an institutional review board. And there has to be a justification for why that deception is necessary, for why your results wouldn't be valid without it. And following the study, there has to be a debriefing where you explain the situation and the real goals of the study to the participants. And that has to be evaluated in terms of not doing harm to the participants. Another concern with research is that research can be biased. There can be a gender or sex bias where some differences are unduly magnified. For example, in the past, it was considered that aggression was really a trait more of boys. And so a lot of early studies of aggression only focused on boys. And so there was this deliberate exclusion of girls. Uh, because aggression was thought of as a boy thing, we only need to observe the boys. And so it was only later that researchers realized that it was important that aggression happened with girls too. And it was important to do studies of a very different type of aggression that we'll talk about later in the semester. Um, Another example here of ethnic or cultural bias is the word ethnic gloss, and this is a term you should all know. This is when we treat an ethnic group as all being the same. So we put this ethnic label on this group, and we sort of give the notion that everybody in that group does this, which if you step back and think about it, you know that's not correct. But with ethnic loss, we tend to paint this broad picture and say Asian Americans study hard and do well in school. And so really it's a stereotype. So ethnic gloss, even though it's not intentional, can be a way that research can be biased. It's also important to think critically when you read research findings, especially when you read them in the media or on the internet. So be cautious when you read a media report about research outcomes. Don't assume that because the this is repeated by someone else that makes it more accurate, or that because the media reports it that they're reporting it accurately. Don't overgeneralize. Remember that most studies were conducted with a given sample, so make sure you understand what that sample was when you think about how those findings can be applied to the broader population. Don't accept a single study. Remember replication, which means that we can conduct the same study and get the same results with different samples and with samples in different areas. Remember that correlation doesn't mean causation. That's one of the most important aspects of critical thinking that is lost in media reports. A lot of times, descriptions of research findings that you read in a secondhand source, such as the internet or a media report, use causal logic to talk about what was correlational findings. So always be skeptical of any description that suggests that this is a causal relationship. Always go back to make sure that how this design was it a true experimental design. Also consider the source. Remember that anybody can put up a website that looks like it's actually something. Remember that a lot of groups have a bias or a reason or an agenda that they wish to promote. Sometimes those are agendas that you may agree with. You still have to be critical of that. For example, there's an organization 0 to 3, whose mission is to promote uh, positive education for young children. I support that mission. I think that's a great idea. But I know if I look at their website that any information they put there is for the agenda, for the purpose of supporting education, saying that education is a good thing, is saying this is out of home education. So they may not include every study. They're going to be selective in what they include. So even when you agree with the agenda of an organization, remember to be skeptical of, of the information they're providing. So some critical thinking steps. First is check your reading comprehension. Did you get the main idea? Analyze other information that's relevant to this. What do we know from other studies? How can these findings be used in different contexts? Connect what we know about one period of development or domain with others, and use the research and theory to help us understand our own lives and those around us. One of the biggest challenges in child development and thinking critically about child development research is the fact that we were all children and that we all had experiences with school and with family, and we have our own life stories that cloud and bias our judgments. All right, this is a little bit of a shift, and so I'm going to move from talking about research designs to talking about assessment. And the reason I'm putting this here is because assessment uses many of the same kinds of measures that we use in research, but for a different purpose. With assessment, the purpose of using those measures like tests or interviews or observations is to determine how well a child is progressing along some dimension. And in the United States, we've had a movement and a push for what's called accountability over the last few decades. And the reasons for that was to better understand and assess how effective our education system is, and our social services for children are, and to assess whether children from all backgrounds are getting equal benefit. So, are some schools doing something better than others? And if so, is that being disproportionate? Are kids in poverty getting a short end of a stick? The goal of assessment then was to improve the measures of educational success. And we've seen sort of a mixed blessing over the last couple of decades. On the one hand, this accountability movement has helped teachers to focus on what sort of impact their teaching practices has on children with different backgrounds, on children with disabilities, and to assess children's level and need, and to think about appropriate interventions that might work for all children. On the other hand, there's been a lot of increased stress and pressure put on teachers. You've heard criticism of sort of teaching to the test or narrowing the range of teaching because of topics that will be on the standardized test at the end of the year, uh, and sort of not much emphasis giving on the whole child, on things like art and play and rest and downtime, uh, because those things aren't measured on the test at the end of the year. Also, standardized testing often doesn't account for cultural differences and cultural diversity. So if one of the goals was to benefit children of, especially children living in poverty, because we know that there's a gap there in the services that they're receiving from schools. And if the goal is to identify that and to benefit those kids, unfortunately, many times it had kind of the opposite result, where we sort of penalized those children who are living in poverty, uh, and blamed them instead of the schools or the systems that they were in. I'm going to tell you two words about assessment: summative and formative assessment. And summative assessment is like this idea that I was just talking about, this test at the end of the year, perhaps a standardized test, this overall evaluation. How did children do this year? What is their growth? What is their progress after some long period? These tests are usually quantitative, and that's so that you can standardize them, compare one child's score to another, or average across a group of children and compare one school to another. These are used by policymakers and funding organizations and schools to determine if standards and educational goals are being met. So the questions here are: what kind of progress are students making? Are they receiving the level of education that we intend for them to receive? Are they ready to progress to the next level? Have they demonstrated that they have achieved the standards? Formative assessment is different from that overall summative assessment. Formative assessment is conducted as we go. So, measuring behavior or learning over shorter periods of time, frequently. And the goal here is sort of like action research. How am I doing now? What's going on with the child? So think of a spelling test that maybe every Friday children take a spelling test. That's a formative assessment. How are they doing this week on that list of spelling words? And at the end of the year, we'll have the summative assessment about their reading and language skills. These formative assessments could be quantitative, where you could put a number to them, or they can be qualitative, like a open-ended observation. They're used by teachers to chart the progress of how children are doing so that they can determine, okay, we need to spend some extra time on this subject, we need to spend some extra time doing that. So there are different kinds of formative assessments. These are some examples of quantitative methods. One is a developmental checklist, where there are a series of statements or developmental milestones that the teacher or caregiver checks off that this child has met that. So does this child uh, place unit blocks on top of the other? Yes. Does this child play cooperatively with peers? Yes. Second is a time sample. And what a time sample means is, say I want to know, are children participating in the art area? And so every minute I look around the room and I record what each student is doing. And over time, I can boil that down and I have a list of these are the areas where they're spending their time. Another example of a time sample might be I want to know how on task students are during uh, our spelling lesson. And so for every minute, I record for each student whether they're on task or off task. And then at the end for each child, I can sum those up. Event samples are different from time samples because instead of sampling every unit of time, every minute, every 5 minutes, every 30 minutes, in an event sample, I'm looking for the event to happen. So maybe I'm interested about aggression on the playground. And every time that there is a hit, kick, or a slap, I make a little mark, or I click a ticker, and I'm getting an overall count. So I'm not looking every minute to see who's aggressive or every half hour. I'm counting it every time it happens. And that's called an event sample. There are also qualitative types of assessments. One of the most common is anecdotal records. In an anecdotal record, a teacher afterwards, after a situation happens, it could be a social worker too, they'll write down a detailed note on everything that happened. They try to get some ideas about the context of the situation. So this is a summary. It's important that it's objective, which means it's not the the the, the teacher or social worker's opinion. They're trying to write what anybody else would have seen or heard. An anecdotal record is different from a running record because a running record is written as it happens. So it's a very detailed description while it's happening. That's really difficult to do while you're working directly with children. And so an anecdotal record is that summary that's made later. Another kind of qualitative assessment is called a work sample. Uh, you take examples of children's writing or their drawing or photographs of things they've constructed, or uh, any kind of sample. It could be a spelling test of the things they've done. You collect those over time. You look for change. Uh, you might keep them in what's called a portfolio. Both quantitative and qualitative assessments can be used to help parents identify children with special needs. One of the words you'll sometimes hear with assessment is a screening assessment versus a diagnostic assessment. A screening assessment is given kind of widely. It's usually quick, and it's just to say, hey, there's the potential here that there could be some sort of issue. A diagnostic assessment is done in more detail. So it's done with a smaller group of individuals only when there seems to be a reason to do that. The qualitative kinds of assessments can get a better overall kind of picture of detailed information, but the quantitative are more useful in being able to uh, compare one child's progress to the overall group of children. And finally, one type of assessment that we've already been introduced to is that case study. And the case study is that detailed study of one individual child. And so it might include things like the qualitative things like anecdotal records, observations, work samples, pictures or videos, descriptions of social relationships and classroom environments, but other informations as well, like health and medical assessments, clinical interviews, formal screenings, such as autism rating scale. And the idea here with this case study is to build up a set of documentation about this individual child. And that is all I have for today.